Hello, everyone. Hope you all been well. Today on Ghost Travelers Podcast, we'll be talking with Peter Muise. We'll be talking to Peter about how he got into the paranormal field and also talk about his new book called Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts. So please join us on this journey with Peter. All right, Peter, welcome to Ghost Travelers Podcast. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me here, PJ. I'm excited to be on to talk about some spooky, weird stuff with you.
Yeah, same here. So, Peter, if you could, can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got into the paranormal field?
Sure. My name's Peter Muise. I live in Massachusetts. I'm the author of two books that are out right now. The newest is Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, and then my older book from a few years back is Legends and Lore of the North Shore. So they're both kind of local New England themed books. I've lived here in New England my whole life, and I guess when I was a kid, I was growing up in the 1970s, and sort of the early 1970s was a time when a lot of things that we now consider paranormal were sort of coming into the mainstream. So there'd be like the show In Search of, I don't know if you remember the show In Search of, like that was a big thing when I was a kid. So each week they would talk about one, weird thing like crystal skulls, UFOs, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, whatever. Every week they would do one of those. And just, like the $6 Million Man fought Bigfoot. There were shows about UFOs, Atlantis, all this stuff was kind of in the air at the time. So I sort of became, I absorbed some of that. My older brother was into some of that as well, particularly Bigfoot and UFOs. And so I absorbed that from him as well. I guess I would say, that's one stream in my mind. The other one was that I really was interested in like folklore, mythology, legends, things like that. So Greek mythology, Norse mythology, all those things. And so at some point, I went to college, I studied anthropology. And like when you study anthropology, it's this way of looking at things. So you could look at folklore, you could look at mythology, you could look at paranormal stories, all kind of in the same lens, right? Look at all those different things in the same way. And so I kind of got that perspective. And then when I left college, I'm not a professional anthropologist, but I have that mindset still. And I just realized I didn't really know so much about the place I've lived my whole life. Like I'd studied Norse mythology, Greek mythology, but I didn't really know New England. So I started to read specifically about New England and paranormal stories from New England and really old legends from New England as well, from 400, 500 years ago. So, and so that's where I am today. Like I kind of had all this stuff in my brain and I needed to do something with it. So I started a blog in 2008. So that's newenglandfolklore.blogspot.com. That's still up. So I still update that frequently. And then I've written a couple books. I've written short articles and chapters for other people's books as well. So that's me.
Very nice, and that's a lot to take in. So, when you were younger, have you ever had a paranormal experience, or when you got older, have you ever had a paranormal experience, or have you done any kind of investigating?
It's a good question. I guess when I was a small kid, I don't remember how old I was, somewhere between like 5 and 8, so small. My brother and I were out in the backyard playing, and we were playing with our backyard neighbor, and we saw this light in the sky. And must have been like the summer or something, because we were out playing after dark. And then we saw this light in the sky, and it kind of came down behind a hill near us. And I remember we were all just terrified, like we thought we had just seen a UFO come down in our neighborhood. And I really don't know what it was. Like in retrospect, like maybe it was a helicopter, maybe it was I don't know, a flare. It could have been different things, right? But I remember that feeling we had of like kind of amazement and also a little bit of and terror. Like we were scared. Like we ran into my parents' house, and we just would not go back outside. We refused to go back outside, and our neighbor wouldn't go back to his house until his parents came back from church. So we were kind of like, ah. So I remember that experience really vividly, and whether it was really a UFO or not. I mean, I guess it was a UFO because it was unidentified, right? But whether it was a extraterrestrial craft or whatever, probably not. But I just remember thinking it was UFO and that amazement we felt. So, as an adult, sometimes my husband and I will go out and investigate different areas, and we're not really ghost hunters. Like I don't go out with, uh, you know, boxes and things like that, or devices to try to get the quiet recordings that people do. I more just go to see the space, take some pictures, and write about the history of it. Um, And I don't go at night, like I'm too much of a coward, so I usually go to these places in the day usually. So, but we've been to some good spooky places. I've talked on some of these other podcasts I've done about the Ramtail Mill Complex, which is down in Foster, Rhode Island, which is kind of a rural part of Rhode Island, west of Providence. And it's just it was a mill, like an industrial mill that was built in the 1700s, so really old, and was built by the side of this river. There's a good legend around it about this man named Peleg Walker. So Peleg Walker was the manager of the mill. So he would oversee the other workers, and every morning he would ring this bell to summon the workers to come to the mill and start their day, because there was a village that had grown up around this mill. So one day Peleg Walker says to the owner of the mill, I've been a great worker for you. I'm really diligent. I'm hardworking. I would like to marry your daughter. And the owner of the mill just laughed, like, no way. Like, I'm a rich mill owner. You are my employee. No way is my daughter marrying one of my employees. It's just not going to happen. So Peleg Walker is really distraught. He's really upset, and he rushes out of the mill into the woods. So next morning, people hear the bell ringing, ding, 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 ding. So they get up in the village. They go into the mill to go to work. And they're horrified to see that Peleg Walker is hanging from a rope from the bell, because he was so upset about, being turned down for this marriage that he has killed himself. He's hung himself from the rope, and the bell is ringing because his corpse is making its sway. All the workers are really freaked out, as you can imagine. The owner's like, just pay no attention. He cuts down the corpse, drags it off, and says, everybody just go back to work. So people go about their day. Next morning, the bell rings, everyone gets up, they go into the mill, and they can see that the rope is swinging on its own, and the bell is just ringing as if an invisible hand is pulling the rope. And so people, again, they're freaked out. The mill owner says, oh, don't pay any attention to this. He cuts down the rope entirely, so there's no rope. He says, then tomorrow just come when you hear the roosters crow, whatever. So people go about their day. The next morning, again, the bell rings. People are a little confused. They go to the mill. They go inside, and they can see the bell is moving. There's no rope at all, so it can't be the wind, and it's a heavy bell. And it's just swinging on its own and ringing, 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 ringing. And so at this point, as if people didn't already guess, they realize that this mill is haunted, that Peleg Walker's ghost still is in this mill. And so people quit. It's the 1700s. People are not into ghosts at all. It's a much more superstitious era. So people just quit, and slowly no one will work at this mill. And at nighttime, people claim to have seen Peleg Walker's ghost walking around in the mill building carrying a lantern, as if he's doing his nightly rounds. So they see him, this lantern moving through the mill. So people abandon the village, the mill shuts down. And if you go there today, so it's now probably 250 years later, you can see the foundations of these buildings. And some of them are quite big. There's a road there. There are stone walls that used to divide up the different lots and things like that. So you can see the ruins of this village, and you can see the ruins of this mill. And when we went there, it was probably a late March day, and we saw two other people there. We were there for a couple hours, so we only saw two other people in this whole time. And it's just it was an unnerving place. Something about it was spooky and a little weird to us, particularly to me. And I remember taking photos with my iPhone. I was just taking pictures of the foundations and some stuff like that. And some of the photos didn't come out. They just came out pure white, which is really strange, because how does that happen on an iPhone, that a picture does not develop, right? It's not we're using film or something like that. And so I found it I was freaked out. The people who work at the mill, I was freaked out by that. And I don't know, was it something supernatural? Was it just a glitch in my phone? I don't know, but in that setting at that time, I was like, "Ooh, this feels like it's something supernatural." In retrospect, maybe it could have been something else, but I often say that my belief in the supernatural is kind of a situational thing. If I am in the place at the moment and weird things are happening, I'm like, "Oh yeah, this is definitely supernatural." And then maybe later, if I'm in a well-lit, apartment or house, I'm like, maybe it wasn't supernatural, But
Yeah.
You know how that is, so.
So when you write your stories, do you often go visit these locations before you write them down, for your own personal experience, and when you interview the witnesses of the locations to document their experience in the books?
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes we go to these places, but often I don't. A lot of the things I read about are older, so I will go back to like sources from the 1600s to 1700s, and so I'm writing about the legend itself, right? Writing about what people say about it. And sometimes we don't usually interview people. Occasionally people will write to me and tell me about their experiences, in which case I will like put that in the blog or put that in a book if someone writes to me about their experiences with something. But so it's a mix of like research and then excursions. And I update the blog every week, so I don't unfortunately have the time to travel like every week, but we try to go when we can to see something interesting. And I will say, like, I love old cemeteries. That's one of my favorite places to go. I just will, like, if there's an old cemetery, I'm like, yeah, let's go see that old cemetery. That's the place to be.
Yeah, most definitely, because with the old cemeteries, I think it's like very interesting since I'm a paranormal investigator. It's really cool to go before you go to that location and visit the local cemeteries to learn about that person you're trying to communicate. And it's really cool to read the information on their tombstones.
Yeah, right. Then just learn the history of the people and the place before you go in, right? So you kind of have a base understanding of what happened there, or who the people are, is interesting. Whether you're like a paranormal investigator or just interested in like the legends associated with someplace like that, you know. We did
Yeah.
go to a really spooky cemetery in Truro, Massachusetts. So I don't. Truro is way out on Cape Cod. It's like the second to last town on Cape Cod. So it's like
Okay.
way out there. It's in the summer it's got a lot of tourists, but the rest of the year it's not so busy. And there's a cemetery there called the Pine Grove Cemetery. And in the late 1960s, late 1960s, this man named Tony Costa, who was unfortunately a serial killer, murdered several women and buried them in the woods behind this cemetery. And he was arrested and died in prison. So if you go into the cemetery, you kind of drive down this road through the woods. It's a dirt road. Then you come to the cemetery, and some of it's very beautiful, just like beautiful old stones and even some beautiful new stones. Sort of towards the back of the cemetery is this crypt, which is half above ground, half under a hill, and it's always open. The door doesn't lock. And according to legend, like they say, this is where Tony Costa dismembered his victims. I don't know if that's really true. That's where he dismembered them, but that's sort of the legend attached to this crypt. Maybe it was just a crypt that the cemetery workers used to store bodies temporarily, because sometimes crypts have like a holding crypt. But I still did
Yeah.
not go inside the crypt. Like I was like, no, I don't think I'll go inside the crypt. Like I stuck my camera and I took some pictures, but I was not going into that crypt. But then from the back of the cemetery, there's a road that goes into the woods, and that is where the police found the bodies. He had buried several of them in the same place. He would lure women there and say, "Oh, well, do you want to come and see my marijuana patch?" is what he would say. And it was the late 60s. People were like, "Ooh, sure, marijuana, so novel, so daring." So they would go with him, and then he would basically tie them up and kill them. And so we were walking down this road in the woods, a dirt road, and just completely silent, like we're like miles away from the road where the car was, just completely silent and just spooky. Like no birds, no insects, like nothing. And it was creepy, And then we came to this crossroad in the woods where the roads met. And I was like, if I was some sort of like super goth person, like this is where I'd come to do my spooky, Halloween ritual or whatever. And we left. Like my husband was like, yeah, this is a creepy place. We should leave. Like this is an unsettling, creepy place. Let's get out. So we left. But reading later that that crossroad actually was where Tony Costa had buried his victims. Like they had been buried just, a few feet from there. So that was disturbing. Like, I don't know. I think it's good when we go to visit these places and me, whoever, like you should bring a friend, at least one person when you go to these places, just because often they're isolated, I think, out in the woods or out in wherever. So I feel like
Yeah.
even if you just want to even make sure that you don't run into like other trouble, maybe not ghosts, maybe not monsters, but maybe just like maybe somebody else is taken up to, building a meth lab or whatever out in those woods. So I think it's helpful to always have a friend with us when we go to those places.
Yeah, most definitely. So you just written a book and just released it this past September. Can you tell us a little bit about it and what made you that you wanted to write that book?
Sure. Yeah. So the book I wrote was Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, and so it's a collection of historical accounts of witches and warlocks of Massachusetts, like witchcraft trials, basically. Then it's legends about witches from the 1700s and 1800s, and then there are also some paranormal encounters as well from like the 20th century and early 21st century of people who have investigated places where the ghosts of witches or ghosts of the witch hunt victims supposedly haunt. So it's like 70 different stories, and then several sections just about the Salem witch trials. And I really, in Massachusetts, there's just this long history of witchcraft and witchcraft stories and witchcraft trials. And as someone who sort of investigates legends, I'd kept looking for like one book that had all the witchcraft stories in one place. And that book didn't exist. So I was like, okay, I found all these legends. I'm putting them in one book because this is the book that I want myself. So it's basically like a book that I wanted to read is what I ended up writing. And even now, like when I will go back and refer to my book, like, oh, I totally forgot I put this in this book, but it has everything like in there so I can read it. And just, for people who are listening or watching, I want to say, like, when I talk about witches, I'm not talking about like modern witches, like Wiccans or people who, honor the earth or work with crystals or herbs or things like that. That's sort of a different type of witch. That's a modern witchcraft. That's a spiritual path. Or it's not a negative thing. But in the past, like particularly in the 1600s or early 1700s, people in Massachusetts had a different definition of witch, which they basically thought a witch was someone who would hurt you using magical means, right? Using magical forces to harm their neighbors or other people in their community. So that's the definition that I'm looking at more in this book, is like that older definition of witch, because that's what a lot of the legends are about, like these kind of malevolent witch figures who, some of them are purely legendary, some of them are based on people who lived who are, falsely accused by their neighbors of being witches, I think.
Very interesting. If you could, can you tell us like one of I guess some of your favorite stories that you've written in the book, or it could be some of the witch trials and stuff like that, or the paranormal stories from the book?
Sure, that's a tough one because I like them all. I mean, here's an interesting one. There's a woman who lived in Western Massachusetts named Mary Webster, and this was, I want to say, so like maybe the 1670s or 1680s. I'm going to get the date wrong, so pretend I don't know the date, but it was before the Salem witch trials. So it's like somewhere between the 1670s, 1680s. Mary Webster lived out in Hadley, Massachusetts, which is far out in the western part of the state. And she had been accused of being a witch by people in her community. And since witchcraft was a capital crime punishable by death, people in Hadley sent her to the capital, which was Boston, to be put on trial. And the judges in Boston said, she's not a witch, she's innocent, we're sending her back to Hadley. So they sent her back to Hadley, back to her home, and her neighbors were really unhappy about this. But they couldn't really do anything because she had already been found innocent of witchcraft. So one of her neighbors, a wealthy man named Philip Smith, he tried to help her by giving her money and things like this, but she refused his help because he had been one of the people who had initially accused her of witchcraft. And so shortly after she refused his help, Philip Smith became sick. And at first he was like, I'm sick, but it's okay. Like, this is God's plan for me. They were Puritans, so they're very devout. They, would frame things in that way. He's like, this is part of God's plan for me. It's totally fine. Then his symptoms got worse and worse and worse, till finally he was in incredible pain, and he started to scream out that Mary Webster has cursed me. I can see her spirit hovering around me, and it's tormenting me. And soon after this, people in his house start to experience strange phenomena. Like, they would smell like a strong animal scent would fill the house, like a musky smell. And they thought they could feel like an invisible animal, brushing against their legs while Philip Smith was lying in bed. Medicine they made for him would disappear from the house, all of these things. And so they were really convinced that Mary Webster was a witch who was causing this to happen to Philip Smith. And so an angry mob actually formed and went to Mary Webster's house. And they dragged her out of her house and they hanged her from a tree. No trial, nothing. They just hanged her from a tree. And for some reason, they cut her down. It's not clear why they cut her down. Maybe they thought she was dead. Maybe someone talked some sense to them. But they cut her down from the tree and they just buried her body in the snow. And amazingly, she lived. Like, she survived that ordeal and lived. And Philip Smith died, a couple weeks later, but Mary Webster lived on for another 10 or 15 years after that. And so it's an interesting story because it's this mob of vigilantes taking things into their own hands and basically, hanging an innocent woman. And the writer Margaret Atwood who wrote The Handmaid's Tale, was doing research, and she realized that Mary Webster was one of her ancestors. And so she wanted to write a book about Mary Webster because she was really fascinated by the story. But she ended up not writing a book set in Puritan Massachusetts, but instead wrote The Handmaid's Tale. So Mary Webster was the inspiration for The Handmaid's Tale, which became a really popular book and now a TV show. So that was really interesting to me. I hadn't really known that until I was researching this book, that was the inspiration for The Handmaid's Tale. And you can see it, even The Handmaid's Tale has almost a puritanical society, but slightly in the future. And again, women are very controlled, and there's a lot of hangings and things like that in it. So that was interesting to me. So I liked learning that story myself.
Yeah, most definitely. And that's a new story for me. I never heard that tale before, even when I went up to visit Salem, Massachusetts a couple years ago, and I never heard about that. Since we have a short amount of time together, I just read your blog about your Christmas story about the witch trials and stuff like that. Can you tell us a little bit about it if no one hasn't read about it yet?
Sure. So, Christmas now, the way we celebrate Christmas is, kind of a family holiday, right? It's very focused on get together with your family, and a lot of it is focused on kids, kids opening presents under a tree and Santa Claus, and it's very it's a domestic holiday. And sure there are parties and things, but it's more of a domestic peace and love kind of holiday, right? It's a season of love.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't always used to be that way, and people in the past had very different feelings about Christmas. So here was the story that you were talking about, PJ, that in 1662, which is a long time ago, let's face it, a woman named Rebecca Greensmith in Hartford, Connecticut, was accused of being a witch. So her neighbors, whatever, had been experiencing various misfortunes, illnesses, crops dying, animals getting sick, the usual things. They were looking for somebody to blame, so they blamed Rebecca Greensmith, who was, not a popular person, I guess, in that community. So she was put on trial, and while she was during the trial, she actually confessed that she said, "Oh yeah, I'm a witch," which people would often do because they were tortured during these trials and things like that. So she confessed. She said that she had met the devil in the woods, but she had not yet signed a contract with him. So she hadn't yet put her name in the devil's book. But that was going to happen, she said, on Christmas Day. That was the big day she was going to sign her name over to the devil and become a witch, was Christmas Day. And all the judges and the Puritan ministers who were presiding over the trial were like, "Oh yeah, that makes total sense to us. That makes total sense to us because Christmas is such an unholy, dangerous holiday." And this is because if you look back in the past, in the 1600s and earlier, Christmas was a holiday where there was heavy drinking, heavy partying, and particularly people lower in the social hierarchy would drink heavily, and then they would go door to door to their wealthy neighbors' houses and beg for things, right? So they beg for food, they beg for money, they beg for alcohol, they beg for whatever there was. And part of this is because if you think about an agricultural cycle, the late fall, early winter, it was the time when all the crops have been harvested. So all the crops have been harvested, so there's plenty of food. This is a time when animals are slaughtered, so farmers would think, which animals aren't going to make it through the winter? We have to kill them. So there's fresh meat available. This is also the time when the beer has become ready to drink. So there's all this surplus stuff, right? All this food and alcohol. And often it's in the hands of the wealthier people. And so other people yeah, we want some of that. And so there's this kind of ritualized activity where people get together and they go out at night and they go to their neighbors' houses and they beg for food, they beg for alcohol, they beg for, whatever, which basically is Christmas caroling. Like Christmas caroling now, you think of like, people, well-dressed people singing sweetly outside your house on, on a beautiful snowy night. But in the past, like you read the lyrics of these Christmas carols and they are more like, give us a figgy pudding, bring it to us right now. Like those are the lyrics. Like people wanted stuff. They come into your house and they want your cake, they want your bread, they want your beer, they want whatever you have. And the wealthier people felt obligated to give it to them. So it's kind of Christmas in the past. That's how it was celebrated. It was like this kind of disruptive holiday. Picture like a mix between Halloween and New Year's Eve. Like put those together, and that's what Christmas used to be like. Like it was more like heavy drinking and people out in the streets begging for things. So it was a very different holiday than we have now, which is why the Puritans were like, oh, clearly this is why Rebecca Greensmith was going to sign her name in the Devil's Book on Christmas, because Christmas is, it's just an unholy holiday. It's all these drunk people out in the streets begging for things. Like, of course, this is the devil's holiday. And some of this is just that the Puritans, were very much about like order and hard work and sobriety. Like they were not a bunch of partiers, right? That wasn't their thing. And so for them, Christmas was just kind of this holiday they wanted to stamp down. And actually, if you look at like Plymouth, which, one of the probably the earliest Puritan colony in North America, like their second year in Plymouth, people in Plymouth started to celebrate Christmas. And the governor went out and said, no, like, stop it. You can't celebrate Christmas. No, get back to work, everybody. Like, no Christmas in Plymouth. Like, it's not allowed here. And so that mentality stayed in New England till like the mid-19th century. So like 1850s or so. That's when Christmas started to be celebrated here. Before then, there was no Christmas. It was just not allowed. So it's interesting to just think that Christmas at the time had these negative kind of almost spooky connotations for people.
Yeah, most definitely. I think it was like the Christmas Carol movie. It shows the dark periods of that time and stuff like that, and it tells the ghost stories from a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of glad that we kind of live in this century that it's mostly celebrated with joy and happiness and giving and stuff like that.
Yeah, but you're right about like the ghost stories, because you see that in A Christmas Carol. I think there's that Christmas song, the most wonderful time of the year, but there's the lyrics like, we'll tell scary ghost stories and tales of the glory of Christmases long, long ago. And most people now are like, well, we don't tell scary ghost stories at Christmas, but they would in the past. And I think in England, they still might tell ghost stories at Christmas more than we do. But it makes sense. Like it's the darkest time of the year. Everything is kind of dead and cold. So you can almost see like, we celebrate more of the spooky death imagery at Halloween, but you can see how that could spread into other seasons, right? Like it's still dark, cold, and dead for a long time, so the spookiness might last for a while, I guess. And I think
most definitely.
Yeah.
Well, Peter, I would really like to say thank you so much for coming on Ghost Travelers Podcast today. For somebody who would like to purchase your book and learn a little bit about you and read your blog, can you tell us where people can find your info?
Sure. So my books you can buy any place online: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Bookshop, Books a Million, any place like that. So it's Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts is my newest book, and then my other book is Legends and Lore of the North Shore. And you can also find me through my blog. It's just called New England Folklore, and you can find it at newenglandfolklore.blogspot.com.
And with the links that you just mentioned, I'll put in the bottom of the description of this video podcast and audio podcast where people can find it a lot easier for them to look you up and maybe say hi and have a ghost story for you.
That'd be great. Yeah, I would love that. I love to hear people's stories. I'm always excited to learn a new legend, which is great.
Yeah, same here. Well, Peter, again, I don't want to hold much of your time. I would like to say thank you for coming on my podcast tonight. I would like to wish you and your husband a Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
We don't talk before Christmas. Well, everyone, I'd like to say thank you for your time being here. Take care and travel safe.